United States is basically continuing its old, policies of global dominance. That the shift is, the any course correction is just cosmetic, and that what we have instead is, this, how do you call it, strategic sequences and division of labor. I don't read it quite that way. I think that the document, corroborates what Marco Rubio already announced in his confirmation hearings, in January of this year, when he said that the post-World War II global order is more than obsolete, and that it has been weaponized against the United States. In simple terms, nothing has really changed. Washington calls it strategy, but it's the same dominance mindset. And Rubio admitting the old world order is now weaponized against the U.S. shows the real problem. America built a system it no longer knows how to control. United States is not taking a modest role. They do seek to establish a dominant role in this multipolar global order, but is nevertheless acknowledging that things are changing, that the path that the United States has been on has been misguided and unsustainable, and that the United States is taking a different turn. So that is all explicitly stated in the document. In simple terms, this is Washington trying to have it both ways. They're rejecting the old globalist model and admitting the old path was unsustainable. But they still want to stay on top in a multipolar world. It's a shift in language, not in ambition. The U.S. is finally acknowledging change, but it isn't ready to accept what that change truly requires. Leaders for refusing to end the war in Ukraine. It pointed at a reason towards this as them being undemocratic, authoritarian opposition. I mean this. It reminded me a bit about when J.D. Vance went to the Munich Security Conference and said that Europe's enemies were domestic, which meant our leaders, that they're the ones who are now know. And as I said, there's also a note in there where it says that one of the solutions has to be to cultivate resistance to Europe's current trajectory within European nations. It's not quite a regime change, but it does suggest that the U.S. should help Europe to get off its current path, which is by our undemocratic, authoritarian leaders. Essentially, this is quite a damning document for the Europeans who've been doing everything they can in terms of showing their obedience, hoping to win the affection of Trump. Yes, correct. There are some very explicit statements in there, which in fact imply that the United States will work with European nations, with certain structures of European nations to change their current policy. In simple terms, this is Washington openly scolding Europe. It frames European leaders as the obstacle, undemocratic, authoritarian, and unwilling to end the war. And striking part is the suggestion that the U.S. should cultivate resistance inside European countries. That's not regime change language, but it's uncomfortably close. It shows that even after years of loyalty to Washington, Europe is still treated as a junior partner that needs correction, not consultation. I'm trying to find it. But here, for example, it says, quote, American diplomacy should continue to stand up for genuine democracy, freedom of expression, and unapologetic celebration of European nations' individual character and history. America encourages its political allies in Europe to promote this revival of spirit, and the growing influence of patriotic European parties indeed gives cause for great optimism. So, Europeans could Europeans, let's call it the still dominant EU, centered structures could rightly interpret this as Americans' interference in their internal affairs. But at this stage, this interference will be very much welcomed by many forces in the EU, which today might be silent, but might be so strong that they could probably overturn the old order on a very short notice. Krainer's point is simple. The U.S. is openly backing nationalist parties in Europe. That's interference, even if it's framed as support for democracy. And while EU leaders will see it as overreach, Krainer suggests many inside Europe would actually welcome it because the old order is far weaker than it looks. The support for parties like IFD in Germany, support for sovereigntist parties on the left and on the right in France, Italy, other European countries is probably it's silent, but it's a giant that maybe just needed this signal from the United States to be more assertive. And so, political options like Macronen, Meritz, Starmer, they are on the back foot, and this is quite a devastate for them. Now, especially, let's say, outside of this agreement, there's also now a concrete conflict that is completely relevant to this document, and that is Europe's attempt to censor and silence Elon Musk's X, trying to force him to censor free speech in Europe, and then even imposing $120 million fines for them for refusing to censor free speech in Europe. And we've also seen that X has become the #1 source of news for all countries in the European Union. So this is like a huge battle that's taking shape, which the Europeans are almost certainly going to lose. Krainer's point is clear. U.S. support could awaken Europe's silent sovereigntist movements and put leaders like Macron and Starmer on the back foot, and the battle with Musk's X shows the same weakness. Europe is trying to censor its top news platform, but it's a fight Brussels is likely to lose. And so, the consequences of that are probably going to play out in the very short term, in the next several months. But I think it might lead to a wave of regime changes in Europe. And I found it very interesting that, so we don't have this officially confirmed, but according to the German journalist Patrick Bob, with whom I think you interviewed him very recently, if I'm not, 2 days ago. Yeah, exactly. So he was saying that one of the things that were being discussed in Moscow last week was the reconnection of the Nord Stream pipelines, which is extremely interested in light of the fact that there were no German representatives in Moscow. And so to me, the implication of this is that the United States is anticipating that there will be a change in government in Germany, which Germany is still the biggest power in Europe, in the European Union, and so that could in fact lead to the disintegration of the European Union if gets to form the next gov. Basically, warning that Europe could see rapid political upheaval, even regime changes within months, and the Nord Stream discussions in Moscow without Germany present hint at something bigger. Washington may already be expecting a new German government. If that happens, he says the EU itself could start to unravel. But I think the more troubling reactions might come from, let's say, the deep state structures. And I think that here, the reactions might get very ugly. And this is not going to be discussed in the open. But they have a very long track record of taking down governments. And I think that there's a danger that they might try to take down Donald Trump's government, if not by assassination of Donald Trump, then by staging color revolutions. And the danger of this is taken very, very seriously by the Americans, by their own security state. The danger here is that, we've seen investigative reports that have found money flows of over $2 billion from certain European billionaires and various charities and endowments towards the so-called progressive causes in the United States. So, they always like to wrap this in some kind of a non-controversial, nice, libertarian, or at least liberal cause like fighting racism. So, they'll funnel money towards Black Lives Matter. Then, diversity, inclusivity, and DEI. What is it? Okay, well, you know what I mean. Then it goes to LGBT groups, and then there's also there are various groups and causes that they support with these hundreds of millions of dollars. Krainer is issuing a blunt warning. If Europe shifts politically, the reaction from entrenched power structures could get dangerous. He's suggesting that the same forces with a history of toppling governments might target Trump's administration, not necessarily through violence, but through coordinated political destabilization. His point about foreign money flowing into U.S. progressive causes underscores the risk these networks already exist, and they can be mobilized quickly. For Krainer, this isn't paranoia. It's a reminder that power never gives up quietly. And we know that some of these groups actually have smaller but more militant segments in them, and many of them are actually receiving training with lethal weapons. And so, these segments could be your future rioters, saboteurs, revolutionaries, and even assassins. And you know, when the UK, when war in Ukraine ends, you might get a transfer of remaining Azovites to go back to the United States and to become involved in these revolutions, and also some of the radical Muslim militants from the Middle East, North Africa, and so forth. So, I think this is a real danger, and I think that we might see the United States shaping up as a bat, always meant to be. You know, this was always coming, because the Western Empire is viable so long as the United States is on board. Without the United States, it becomes a disunited patchwork of minor powers like Britain, France, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Israel. It's no longer viable because it's even geographically dispersed, and then it loses its biggest economy, largest military, biggest source of funding, and so forth. So for them, it's keeping the United States on board is a matter of life and death, and they will not hesitate to do whatever they must to bring the United States back on board. And I think that this battle will shape up, and we already see it. You know, with things like No King's Protest. This too was being funded by some of this leftist liberals, sponsors, some of whom originate in Europe. Krainer's closing warning is stark. The same activist networks receiving funding also contain small militant factions capable of real disruption, even violence. He argues these groups could become shock troops in future unrest, especially if hardened fighters from Ukraine or the Middle East enter the mix. His larger point is this: the Western system only works if the US stays aligned. If America drifts, the entire structure weakens. That's why, in his view, powerful interests won't hesitate to intervene politically or otherwise to keep the US on course. And he sees early signs of that struggle already unfolding.